everybody. So right now we are on the Wednesday Wars March reading questions. So let's get started. You will also find this in our 7A support Google Classroom. So it says, in his coverage of the Vietnam War, what does Walter Cronkite report about conditions for Marines in Khe Sanh City in Vietnam? How does Holling's father react to this broadcast? Hint, what does he say and what does he hold on to? So on page 157 is where we would find that. It says, I made a note that he was worried and concerned for everyone fighting. I will read you the quote that I found. It says, right on top of 157, sometimes though my father himself would shake his head and whisper, 5,000 boys trapped. Good Lord, 5,000. We'd watch the pictures of the Marines in their zigzagging trenches or deep in their bunkers, holding their heads over their ears inside their helmets because of the thunder of the mortar shells. Then my father would reach for my mother's hand and they would look at each other. So just by that, reading it, and when you visually picture it, you can tell, Mr. Hood is reaching over for Mrs. Hood for as concerned and comfort, because he's probably scared and concerned. So then, on question 2. At the beginning of the chapter, Holling explained that Mrs. Baker kept wiping at her eyes during grading. She has told us it was a terrible cold. Her eyes were mostly red all the time. Sometimes she just stopped whatever she was doing and looked somewhere far away, like she wasn't even in the room anymore. It was a terrible cold, and day after day it kept on, even seemed to be getting worse. So that is on page 161. So let's go to page 161. And the question is, what is the real reason why she keeps wiping at her eyes? And what do you think is on her mind? So the hint says, think about the news she received at the end of February and what has been announced on the news. So at the end of the February chapter, it talked about how a helicopter went down and Mrs. Baker, husband, Lieutenant Baker, has went missing. So Holling is saying, he's implying that it's not she has a cold, that why her eyes look so watery and red, and why she keeps staring off to the distance. She's probably thinking about her husband, and she's probably very worried. But she's probably telling her students, oh, it's just a cold, because what we have learned about Mrs. Baker is that she is a pretty private person. So that could be why she's not saying anything. So for 3, what does Mr. Hood tell his daughter about how she will be spending her weekday afternoons and Saturday mornings going forward? So from the start, he tells her that she's going to be the secretary at his office, receptionist, and that she will be working for him, and she says no because she already has a new job. And he says, who's a new job for? And she says, working for Bobby Kennedy. Obviously, this didn't go well, and Mr. Hood was mad. And then the question goes, what does this decision show about him? So they're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then he says, now you've got it. And my father said, you start work Monday afternoon. It's not like, can you start work Monday afternoon? He's not giving her a choice. It's, you start work Monday afternoon. So then on page, this happens. So question 4 follows right after question 3 perfectly, because this happens right after their fight. Why does Holling's sister want to help Bobby Kennedy's campaign for president? Hint, what 2 things is he trying to end? So you will find this answer on page 165 and 166. And what Holling says, why does Holling like Bobby Kennedy more than current President Lyndon B. Johnson. It says on page 166, "Still, I was glad that Bobby Kennedy was running for president. It was hard every night hearing President Johnson and all of his generals with medals spread over their chests say how well the war was going and how the enemy was about to give up, and then having CBS News cut to pictures of soldiers who were wading through rice paddies and holding their rifles above the water, or who were carrying out a buddy whose face was covered with dried blood, or who were huddled in holes and covering their heads as the mortars came over a caisson. After that, you just wanted someone to say plain truth, and maybe Bobby Kennedy would be that someone. I was glad he was running for president." So that's just him saying that he just wants the truth. Because he's right. Like, how are we saying that the war is going, quote unquote, good when all of those horrific pictures are on the news and people in its war? So he was just saying that, you know, he wants the truth of what's going on, like what CBS News is giving. So then it says, what advice does Mrs. Baker give Holling to help him prepare for cross-country tryouts? And what advice does Holling give Mrs. Baker on teaching? So this is funny. Mrs. Baker gives Holling pointers, saying his stance for running, his breathing, like really tearing him apart. And she tells him to be a lot like Jesse Owens. What does this suggest about how their relationship is changing? Oh, so then Mrs. Baker tells Holling to be like Jesse Owens, and then Holling tells Mrs. Baker on teaching, because I would say she's getting observed. He then says to Mrs. Baker, "Oh, well, if you're giving me advice, then I'm going to give you advice that, you know, you shouldn't cross your arms that way. You shouldn't roll your eyes. And whenever someone says something good, that you should say a secret code word." Which then goes to question 6. What does Holling do when the school board members are visiting Mrs. Baker's class that causes her to say Azealia quietly to Holling? What does she mean by this? Hint, this code word that Holling suggests. So it's a code word for something that Holling does good. So Holling, the board members are in Miss Baker's classroom, and somehow it gets brought up because they walked in on Miss Baker giving Holling a Shakespeare book. So they start talking about Shakespeare, and Holling's like, "Oh, well, actually, Miss Baker has been teaching me Shakespeare." And they're a little shocked by that because he's only in 7th grade, and Shakespeare's pretty heavy to understand. So he cites off lines from Shakespeare just from memory, not reading anything. And Mrs. Baker looks at it and says, "Azealia," meaning like, that was great work. And she was proud of him. So 7, what disruption occurs while the school board members are visiting Mrs. Baker's classroom? What 2 characters show bravery, and what do they do? So, guess who pops in? Take a guess. Sycorax and Caliban. That's who. They fall from the asbestos tiles from the ceiling. And the 2 people who showed bravery is Mighty, Mighty and Mrs. Sidman, because everybody else was running around and trying to, get away from the rat, standing on desk, whatever. And Mighty took off one of her shoes and stood behind her desk, ready to swing at anything that had yellow teeth. So she was ready. Then Mrs. Sidman took both of the 2 rats, grabbed them, and was just like, "Okay, where am I putting these?" And walked them down every hallway. I don't think I would ever touch a rat, so good for Mrs. Sidman. And also good for Mighty. So it says, describe what happens during the 7th grade cross-country tryouts. Hint, what motivates Holling to run faster, and what is the outcome? So Holling ends up... So he says, when a girl holds rose up to you. You better run. You run better, let me tell you. So Marilee held up a rose, which was cute. And then Sycorax and Caliban, they're, fussing around in the cages. They're trying to get out. They're like snipping, kind of. Rats will, like, what he says, will show their teeth. So then he ended up winning because it says the exterminator and so on. So he ended up winning, and Holling ended up getting a spot on varsity. So then how do students react to Mrs. Sidman after she grabs the rats? How do they react to my tea after she confronts the rats? Why do you think their reactions are so different? And what do the students make for Miss Sidman, and what do they say about my tea? So my tea obviously has struggled with how people look at her. So it says Mrs. Sidman was the most heroic figure of the story, and even first graders were drawing pictures of her carrying Caliban and Sycorax through the halls of Camilla Junior High. In all those pictures, she looked like a warrior and Ariel had wanted to be, stern and serious and powerful. A third grader drew a coat of arms for her with 2 dead rats beneath her feet. Charles, the 5th grader, of the lovely handwriting, inscribed the motto beneath, "To the death." The D had a whole lot of swirling loops inside it. The only one who came out badly in these stories was my tea, and honestly, I couldn't figure it out. No one but my tea had stood her ground beside Mrs. Sidman, while all the rest of us scrammed across the room. But instead of her getting a coat of arms and being made into a warrior, people started to talk about her, and not just behind her back, but so that they could hear them. About how people in Vietnam ate rats. How she was hoping for a good meal. How she thought they were rat burgers on the run. Stuff like that. So that's, you see how that's mean, right? Like, and by the way, that's on page 181. People are being mean to my tea, even though she showed bravery just as much as Mrs. Sidman did, when everybody else was just sitting around and, trying to get away. So then for 10, what does Danny do to receive a 4-day suspension? Why does he do this? So someone says something terrible to my tea. It says, some 8th grader. So Mrs. Biggio gave my tea her tuna casserole surprise. And one of the 8th graders loudly said to Mrs. Biggio, "Don't you have any rat surprise for her?" And then he turned to my tea and said, "Why don't you go back home where you came from, where you can find some?" And my tea started to cry and just stood there crying. And Danny took entire tray filled with tuna casserole surprise, 2 glasses of chocolate milk and red Jell-O with peaches, and dumped it over the 8th grader's head. And then before the 8th grader could open his eyes to see who had done it, Danny punched him. So I kind of read that, but they added stupid and whatever. But you could tell that Danny knew that it was wrong, and he wanted to stick up for my tea. He didn't do it, from anything else. I think he saw that she was hurt, so he was like, "That's not right. That's not cool." So what does Mrs. Biggio do to apologize to my tea? What does it show about Mrs. Biggio? So there is a dessert that has to do with bananas and coconut, and it seems delicious. And caramel sauce, fried bananas rolled in crushed nuts, dipped in coconut and topped with caramel sauce. And Mrs. Biggio made them for like the entire class. And she was saying how this is like a treat in Vietnam. And then Mrs. Biggio went up to my tea and said, "I am so sorry, my tea, I am so sorry." Because she knew what she has done wrong to her. She knew how badly she has treated her. So then what this is showing about Mrs. Biggio is she knew the entire time what she was doing wrong. I think it was just her, I don't know. And I think I want you guys to all think about that. Why was she acting that way? She knew she was wrong. But I think this shows that Mrs. Biggio is seeing that Mighty is a person and she can't treat them like that. So then Mighty shared everybody a song about, I want to say, bananas, and it ended up being very sweet that she was celebrating her culture with everybody in the classroom. So that's it for March. Please also write your journal right down here. All right. Bye, everybody.